and maybe I'm thinking I'm going at my normal pace, maybe slowing down. But I guess I would equate it to like synchronized swimming. It's like you feel each other's, you feel the tug, and you feel them slowing down. And because not able to keep up with you, you immediately adjust your cadence to that.
Right.
And it's almost like two people who who come together for the first time walking, and they fall into line. It's like they start going in sync with each other, and I'm probably subconsciously adjusting to their gait, but I don't realize that.
Right.
It is just a normal thing. Of course, I'm not thinking about it. I'm just feeling it, and I just go with the feel.
You're feeling the tug.
Yes.
Kind of like I was feeling the tug.
Yeah, there's always going to be, because you're in contact with that person, you have a feedback of some kind.
Right.
And I guess I'm just in tune with that, and the less you think about it, the more you probably get to, if you're consciously thinking, it's a cognitive strain on you, right?
Right.
So if you just do it like it's normal, don't worry about it, then you will adjust to each other's paces. Is what I feel is the case.
Right. So how many of you have experienced that today? We have a few people that kind of experienced that, where they certain comfort level, and you kind of knew how fast, how slow to, and then you can ask. You can just turn around and simply say, am I going too fast or too slow? And the person can then respond, and then you know no, this is great. And then you know you're walking in cadence, you're walking at a comfortable pace for the individual.
Right, plus you're engaging in a conversation with them, so it's just a normal talk, that's the way I
Yes.
This is Ingrid. I know for me, having provided sighted guide, I tend to walk kind of fast. So I know people will just say, hey, slow down, or slow down. So I'll know from them telling me, because otherwise if I'm in my own world and I'm walking, even though they holding on to me, it's like, I'm gone, they'll just say, wait, slow down, you're going too fast. So,
Perfect.
They'll tell you too, and if you feel them kind of stumbling, you need to slow down.
It's communication, two-way communication. That covers it all, right? What other experience did y'all? Yes, Kenya.
And Kenya, another experience where I have a true appreciation for the buttons to open up the door. When I was the guy, the door hit my partner. It's hard to manually open up the door and then try to at the same time move your partner behind you. I have an appreciation for that now. My gosh, that button that and the door's open.
In fact, when I was spotting folks, I had to stop them for a second and encourage them to transfer to the other arm, and so that once the door came to the person who was being guided, they could hold it open. Then you could easily walk through. And that's a really important thing to remember. And it's a little different, but primarily the same when the door is opening into you, and the same when it's opening away from you. If you're positioned correctly, then the person you're guiding has that free hand to just hang onto the door, so it doesn't make it awkward. You don't have to turn around to try to hold the door open. So just a little bit of prevention as you're coming to it can make it a lot more comfortable. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
This is Adrian, and I mentioned this to Paul during the break. I work with Shanti Aaron, who is visually impaired, and all the times that I've acted as a sighted guide for her, she's never said to me, do this, do that, and I've just kind of winged it. So my question to Paul was, is it appropriate in that situation to ask those kind of questions before you get started, if it's your first time doing it? I think at this point we've done it long enough that we've kind of developed a rhythm, but in the beginning it's like I just kind of winged it from that standpoint.
Right. It's very appropriate to ask. Always appropriate to ask, right? Never appropriate to just assume and do. And what you'll find is that if you ask somebody if they would like some guide, someone who's been trained in sighted guide will say, oh sure, and they'll grab your arm, and you kind of know just by their response, once you've done this enough, that they're already trained in sighted guide. If they go, what? then you can explain sighted guide and, here's what you need to do. And it might be also appropriate, and we've had several comments of this when we've gone around the state, and that is parents who are coming in with their children who are guiding them in some very awkward ways. And it's a perfect opportunity, once you get comfortable with the technique, then you can then train it as well. And it's a perfect opportunity to educate the family and the child or the adult, whichever case it may be, on some good technique that makes it a whole lot easier for them and a whole lot less awkward.
And so for myself, I prefer holding on to somebody's right arm. So, somebody who is accustomed to walking sighted guide, or they may tell you something similar. I prefer your right or your left, or something along those lines.
Yes.
This is Roxanne. You talked about your sight went down over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get any training prior to?
Yes. I received training in the school systems from a teacher for the visually impaired. And, but really, let's see, my parents were awesome. So I was never treated special. I had the same responsibility as my siblings. So at that point, like back in high school and during the times where I was living at home, and the teacher for the visually impaired, it wasn't a great deal of training. I didn't have I think I had one orientation and mobility training, but I was very much, I was really independent. And that was something that my parents just really pushed and encouraged. When I got my first job, I came home and I told my mom that I got a job at Kroger. I was a courtesy clerk. And she was supportive, but she said, that's great, but I'm not your driver. So I knew, she said, I can get you sometimes, but it was my responsibility to get myself to and from work. And that was a great life lesson. And it was later on in college where I really needed more of that training. So I wasn't your typical client where I just I was going through a straight training program. I would go to classes, and then the way my classes were scheduled, I would go to a training center and get some orientation and mobility, some vision rehab therapy. And what ended up happening is later, when pretty much all my residual vision was gone, I went through that period again of not feeling comfortable with cooking, with travel. I had lost the skills. I had moved out to the suburbs, and I was always getting, I was really fortunate in always being able to find a carpool that I could use. But as my office locations changed, that got more and more difficult, and I was so out of practice using transportation that I took the initiative to go to one of the training centers, actually while I worked, and I was able to go there for 6 months and then work part-time while I was out there, and that was like blind boot camp.
Well, I just wonder, because I have a client who is in the denial, who has not completely lost their vision,
Yep.
and just wondered, is it appropriate to get them training prior to?
Absolutely. Yeah, because it like mine was a combination, right? So it could be working with John just to get that foundation and having the person feel comfortable, and then maybe they would go later to a training center, or maybe not. Maybe they're able to develop those skills, get everything that they need, and move into an employment situation. Now, I also have some resources in there, and we're going to go into it further in the different modules as far as some resources that are available for you to know about and for your clients to know about for that adjustment piece.
Shirley, that's great for you because you have that source of sense of independence, but most of the time when we're working with children that are visually impaired or have complete blindness, a lot of the times the parents are sheltering their kids very
Yes.
much. They,
Yeah.
and I can understand that because I'm a mother and I have a son.
Mhm.
However, you know, that's kind of like where maybe this may be, you know, part of the job of the counselors, or we're just EWT, but you know, those are just one of the fears that we kind of like come into. How
Yes, and get
would
those
you-
parents connected to other parents.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that's really just instrumental in helping the individuals and the family, getting them connected with other people who are blind and who are going through those same experiences, so they don't feel alone. And then even, you know, between those, there's the National Federation of the Blind, there's the American Council of the Blind, both of them have affiliates here in Georgia, so there's the Georgia Council of the Blind, and there's the National Federation of the Blind of Georgia, and they have parent groups, they have, you know, they have annual conferences. The one for the Georgia Council for the Blind is coming up in May in Gainesville. So the NFB one will be, I'm not sure, sometime in the fall, but most likely in Macon.
They also have a student division as well. And so they run their own division, the students do. So typically you'll have a high school or a college student running the group, but every one of them takes on a part of running that group. And so it's kind of like a leadership model as well, but that's where they can come into contact with other folks that are going through the same type of thing. That's where the parents can talk to other parents. That's a great avenue, is to utilize the consumer groups.
Just a follow-up concern, Paul. I mean, that's great, I guess, you know, however, this is just hypothetical. I'm not saying this happened to me. This is Lindy, by the way, speaking, but we also have students that are visually impaired from a different race, or they're not from the United States, and they can have some immigration issues and challenges that they may be scared to like interact because they don't really want you to know your immigration
With the
status.
consumer groups, it won't matter. With VR, obviously, they're gonna have to be able to, you know, show that they can work in the States. But that's one of our agency rules.
Right. Well,
But as
some-
far as those consumer groups, they don't have anything to do with that.
But I guess that's one thing that, you know, most of their fears are, quote unquote, is what I'm saying. You know?
Sure,
And because some of them, their children may have a social security number, but the parents may not have.
right.
You know, and that might be some of the things that they are actually, you know, be one of the fears that they would have that, in my end, of course, I'm a technologist, but I guess maybe that would be on the part of the counselors, and part of that you still be working, and you kind of just trying to find defined goals for them that where they can be independent and be out in the people that has the same challenges as they are, but at the same time you're trying to help the best you could
Right.
for them.
Sure, because my family is from Chile. So, you know, but I was fortunate, you know, they were open to, you know, or they were encouraging, because I also have a sibling that has the same eye condition as myself. But we were as far as our family goes, we were like this little island here in Georgia. So there was that, but a lot of times I will actually, because I'm bilingual, so I can offer my services to those Spanish-speaking families and explain to them, you know,
Right.
what is out there for them.
Which she just did. Somebody consulted with me just the other day, said I'm working with a Spanish-speaking family, and you're bringing up a really good point, Lemmy, that with different cultures come different myths and
Right.
different ideas about what a blind person can do. And so there may be some things that we're not even aware of within our own culture of what those myths are. And so I didn't really know how to help this counselor with this family, but I reached out to Shirley and said, hey, would you mind meeting with this family and talking with this family? And that way they can converse in their own native language. Might be some different, slight differences, but Shirley said absolutely. having it come from someone who is blind speaks a whole lot more than someone who's sighted coming in and trying to do that, right? And so Shirley is always gracious in trying to assist in that way. So you bring up some really good points.
This is Ingrid, and Shirley, she actually did that for me when I was a counselor. I had a family and the school system had basically failed them. And Shirley came in and she was able to speak their language and connect with them. And then on top of that, Shirley herself had a visual impairment. So she was able to gain the trust of the mother, which helped me as a counselor.
Because that's pretty much
connect.
what it is, it's a issue of trust for them, who they can trust, you know, because it's not just Hispanic speaking. You know,
Right.
there's a lot of people
Yeah,
that
so
had
many.
visual impairment, they came from the Philippines, came from Nepal, from Cambodia, and you know, you really don't speak their language, and they're fresh in the United States, you know, and some of them actually are undocumented, you know, but their children were born here, you know, and so, you know, those are just the things that, you know, you come across and you're trying to handle it, you know, the best practice as much as you can because you wanted to help, and you know, and I guess, you know, on the end, you know, counselors, you know, be able to really guide them in all that, you know, because we're in the side of a technologist, of course, you know, we would like to explore at the same time the goals for them, short-term and long-term, and provide them, you know, where they needed to be, maximizing their potential in that area.
Right.
So
And you
I'm
might-
just trying to, you know, bring it up because there is somebody out there, they don't even get help just because of, you know, the fear. And they're trying to just compensate as much as they could and trying to get help within their own circle of people.
So again, too, in those resources that we're providing, that information is there so that can be shared.
And if we need to hire a translator or an interpreter or whatever's required in order so that we can be speaking the same language, so that they're fully understanding as much as possible what we're offering, that would be one way to go. But you could also connect them with somebody from the consumer group and pull a team together to make sure that that information is being conveyed properly. So thank you for bringing that up. So we're going to move on to our next exercise. Any other thing that somebody has a burning comment that they'd like to make of an experience that they'd like to share before we move on? Okay. So we're going to move on to an exercise now where we're going to do a little role play. And we've got a couple of different conditions and a write-up of some of the things that you need to be bearing in mind. And then at the very end of it is a scenario. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to have people turn around so that two tables are working together. And we'll need a volunteer to be the person who is experiencing vision loss and depicting that scenario. Pick one. One's retinitis pigmentosa, and the other one is diabetic retinopathy. And so pick one, it doesn't matter to us. I'm sure we'll get a mix. And so what we'd like is for you to read that over briefly and then play it out. And what you can do is you can have two people, one person who is with a vision loss and one person who is without, who is playing the role either of the counselor or the front desk person. This is a first initial meeting. This is just an initial conversation when somebody calls on the phone and wants to know about services or has questions to ask. So the next module is going to be how to properly conduct an intake interview. And so this here, we just want to break the ice, get you comfortable with the questions that come about, and so that you can experience that firsthand. And if it's helpful, we still have the simulators. So the person who's playing the part, we can get you set up with 5-degree fields so that you're putting yourself into that mindset as to what it is that you're actually seeing. And the same thing with diabetic retinopathy, we could do that too. So if anybody wants that, please let me know and we'll get you set up. Any questions on the assignment? Shirley, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's good. We just want, it's just an intro.
Yeah, so we got two here. This is the other one. She just, I guess, put a couple per table. Yeah.
So guys, there's more if you guys come later and I'll share the table. Okay, thank
Red line, diabetic retinopathy. You be the person. I think we just read from the. Oh, okay.
Little plastic, and then they sign the box, like they put that layer, and I'll give that. And it really is like
I'm gonna be honest.
so you know, I did different. You know, it's like the people have issues, whether it be you know, and I have to sit down and you would know more than I struggle with my spiel. I understand what you're talking about experience. Because I was a client. We are all that's true. She wants a job.
Do you
I
have,
have these all over my office. You got extra.
do you have?
I have a little
I don't, but we're gonna get them ordered.
Well, you can
Well, I've had a couple that came in and had their own order,
Right.
but we don't have one of those.
The other thing you can do is just take a Kroger card, and if you don't have one, you can take out like Kroger
Right,
card, right?
yeah.
And you put it below the line, and you just tell them, and then they can feel it. So it kind of acts in a similar way. But Robin Wilson from Communications, she just sent us a link to order some. So we're gonna have her order some. Our 800 number on it. That way they're asking us.
Okay.